Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Emanuel Pastreich, who served as the president of the Asia Institute and as the director general of the Institute for Future Urban Environments. He's declared his candidacy for president of the U.S. as an independent in February of 2020. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Mr. Pastreich.
It's an honor to be here.
I came across your work recently, your writing, your interviews, and I thought I had to have you on because you have many unique insights, and you've got a fascinating life experience. And it's kind of hard to peg who you are because of your interesting background. If you could just briefly maybe tell us who is Emanuel Pastreich?
Right. Well, that's a tough one, and I'm maybe not the most qualified to explain myself. I came from a, I guess, relatively establishment background in the United States. I'm still wearing a tie. And I was a professor of Asian studies. So I spent a good part of my life in Korea and Japan, and I studied Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. And when I was at the University of Illinois back in 2001, I became quite committed to opposing the totalitarian rule in the United States, which continues to the day. And as a result of my efforts with others, I ended up being basically unable to work in the United States and was in Korea from 2007. Tried to come back once in 2019, which was not very successful. And I'm back after 3 years away in the United States, just arrived a week ago, trying my best to address real issues in the United States and to try and sort of puncture a hole in this blanket of hypocrisy and fraud, which has crept into every aspect of American society and, of course, by extension, around the world. Talk about real things. And finally, I had declared in 2020, February, when I saw what was happening with this so-called Biden-Trump election, that I would try and run as an independent and address real issues, not with any particular, leftist or rightist perspective, but try and just scientifically address what were the problems in the United States. And this, of course, caused a lot of problems. But it did give me the chance to get in this habit of giving talks, speeches, which has now become my primary means of expressing myself. And I hope we can return to a politics based on intellectual inquiry, on moral commitment, and a real engagement with citizens, as opposed to a sort of fraudulent, feel-good approach to blanket marketing.
Yeah, I purchased your book. I think people can download it for free, and you go through a lot of your points in there. I agree with much of what you say, and maybe just to start with what you were touching on, what's wrong with the U.S. I mean, I'm from Illinois. I'm from Chicago, and 20 years ago, I saw a lot wrong. I mean, I'm a history major, right. Former teacher, former professor of history. And I could just see the cycle of history. The American.
Where were you teaching?
I taught abroad in Kazakhstan.
So you're not in right.
Mexico. Yeah. That's part of the story. I left. I decided to leave the United States, right. And when you're born as American, I never thought we were an empire. I thought we were just a country, right. The United States. Right. And then you realize like some of the stuff we'll get into, like 9/11 and other things. It's like, well, I was like, we're an empire, and we're the biggest empire in the history of the world, and we're starting all these wars, killing millions of people. I mean, there's a lot of good America has done, but a lot of bad. We have to be fair, and there's the militarism. I think we're bankrupt. Financially, you talk about that. I also think spiritually, we're bankrupt.
Intellectually,
we're at each other's throats. There's the techno-authoritarianism. I might get you into trouble. In April, I believe the Department of Homeland Security told PayPal to shut off my account. I'm banned from using PayPal. And
congratulations.
Yeah. And so if you want to tell us basically what's wrong with America as you see it.
I'm going all the way up. I'm going all the way up. I'm letting go in my heart of everything that holds me down. No, no. the sky and I got this relief inside. Then there's no need to hide. I'm going all the way up. I'm going all the way up. I'm letting go in my heart of everything that holds me down. No, no.
Also, if you need health insurance that covers you wherever you may roam, check out my friend James Guzman's Borderless Health Insurance. One of the great things about living internationally is saving money on healthcare, but private care overseas can be expensive. Go to borderlesshealthinsurance.com to watch a short presentation on expat and digital nomad healthcare and sign up for a free consultation to review your options.
Well, it's, to some degree, it's a cyclical process. If you have any institution, government, empire, and it runs 250 years, you start to have these institutional contradictions and collapse. To some degree, it's because the institutions that originally set up no longer correspond with the reality of how decisions are made or how the economy works. So I happen to like the U.S. Constitution, and I refer to it. I think it's not a perfect document, but it gives some basic principles for governance, which I think are quite unique. It was a unique, successful experiment in history. It doesn't mean the United States was successful. It just means that concept of constitutional government, where they took some of the essence of what was discussed in Greece and Rome and sort of tried to take the empire out of it. That was the concept behind it, was a noble experiment that offers much for us. However, especially, it was flawed from the beginning, obviously. Slavery, the destruction of the native peoples, all sorts of the idea of real estate and how it was imported here and enclosure. All that obviously was a flawed. But we did have some good aspects of the United States, which sometimes were positive for the world. But over the last 50 years, the militarization of the economy, and then this move towards a radical expansion of financialization, privatization, and in that process, I think we also have to denote the end of the Cold War, which has been celebrated, of course, in what we're force-fed in media and in academics. But the end of the Cold War was essentially the end of an opposing perspective in the world. So basically, during the Cold War, I'm not saying Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China got it all right. Many things were terrible, but they at least had a different perspective to suggest that things like class struggle, concentration of capital, class issues, and ideology were topics to talk about. These were things that were important. And when the Soviet Union and China basically went over to basically a modified sort of neo-capitalist with a little bit of socialist characteristics mixed in the soup, then we lost that in the world. And so as a result, from the 1990s on, increasingly these ridiculous ideas about economics in the United States or in Japan or in Germany in the 1970s, through the 80s even, there were professors of economics who took Marxist economics as a major part of their approach to economic theory. There are zero people like that now, except for, of course, bloggers. But so we've lost this potential for other perspectives. It's not saying that Marxism is, I'm not a Marxist, by the way, but I'm sympathetic to Marxist analysis. And I think that, addressing class issues and finance and ideology, it's critical. And so we now are in this position in which consumption, growth, exports are assumed by basically everybody to be essential for the well-being of people, or that the stock market has any relationship other than parasitic to the lives of ordinary citizens. These things are accepted as sort of truths, right? Somehow increase the stock market is good for you. And we have these whole variety in the United States, where we're now, of these sort of cardboard messiahs, whether it's Bernie Sanders or AOL or Donald Trump, who come up with these quirky ideas about what economics is, or how we can be more progressive, concerned with working people. But essentially, they buy into the entire economic money system, and they're not interested in saying, why don't we make people independent from money, right? They're not trying to say, we can support ourselves. We don't have to spend money. People in the 19th century, most of them didn't use money. They used it, they go to market once a month to buy things they needed, some, metal products or certain items, clocks. But basically their daily lives, they were able to support themselves, and their communities were able to support them. That is real economics. That's positive. And that's the real meaning of market economy. Horrible term that's been so distorted. Market economy is you go to the market in your community, and you sell carrots or the chairs you made, and you exchange them with your neighbor who has selling butter or fabrics or whatever, and you have this mutual supporting system. Now market economy means Google and Facebook and all these technotyrants, which are essentially, they print up their own money based on devaluing our money, right? And they control the entire system, and they set up these IT systems like what we're doing now, right? In which we're forced to communicate with each other, to exchange, to buy things through them. They control the means of production, means of distribution, means of sales, and the means of communication, and increasingly the ideological structure itself. So they produce, these false conservatives and these false progressives who we're supposed to, buy.
Yeah, that was my next question. And we've got an oligarchy in the U.S., and I think it's just as bad as the Russian oligarchies, or in these foreign dictatorships. It's just, right. I think the issue for us is that Americans have we're more prosperous, and so we kind of care less, as long as we can buy our nice cars and iPhones and stuff. We don't really care about our oligarchy, but they're just as bad, if not worse. And you talk about, again, sham elections, as you just mentioned. I agree with you. Just to read a quote from your book, you say, or one of your articles, I can't recall. I say that if we do not have an election in which someone like me can be a candidate, can have a chance to be covered in the media, that we are not holding elections, but rather holding an impressive sham. We have no intention of recognizing any such sham elections. In fact, until there is an election in which someone like me can get proper attention and the chance to be on the ballot, we will not recognize any of these elections. So, just a quick thought on the elections, because as you say, our left, right, we've got fake conservatives, fake left. No one is anti-war anymore on the left. There's a handful on the right, but they all stay within a certain bounds. None of them ever cross the red line.
Right. Well, I think, obviously the decision to run as independent candidate for president was a serious one. I take it quite seriously, and I put a lot of work into the speeches. I have my book. The preface to my book is out in 40 languages. I don't have Croat, I have many other languages from Central Europe, for that matter, so it was both in the United States and also globally to say, let's have an alternative view, and we've been basically blocked out. So I think these elections they were always flawed. I wouldn't say there was a perfect time, but there's a catastrophic collapse of the political in the last 20 years. And the result has been these sham elections. As I was suggesting in my recent post, now politics is determined not by elections, but by false flag operations, that those 9/11 or COVID-19 or these mass shootings, whatever, these are how politics are determined, not by voting at the ballot. So in order to go back to some sort of logical, scientific, rational process, I think we have to look back in the United States or other countries and say the basis for the United States in the beginning and the ways in which it was successful was based on revolutionary thought, that the United States is a revolutionary country. That's the core of the start. And that we have to say that when you, as the Declaration of Independence notes very clearly, and this is the two founding documents, right? Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, says that in the course of events, if the power is, I don't have the exact quote, but is seized by a small number of people and it becomes a tyranny, then you not only are entitled to, but you have a moral obligation to oppose this and to overthrow it and create a system which is democratic, transparent, and accountable. And that would be my position. So I run as a candidate. I love if people vote for me, if they put me on TV, and if I got attention like Donald Trump or all these bedridden people like Joe Biden. But that's not my purpose. My purpose is to be revolutionary. And so I think the best way that I can affect politics, that we can affect politics, is to take a stand and say, this is the truth. This is what needs to be done. I'm not interested in whether the New York Times or CNN will cover me, because they're so corrupt and useless and dangerous that, as far as I'm concerned, we should lock them all up too. I have no interest in pandering to them. And I would also say that was the major mistake that was made by so many people in the United States over the last, as we fall into this late imperial decay, was this idea that, oh, I have this good idea, might be a good idea, and in order to get it to be achieved, I'm going to compromise. I'm going to downplay it, soften it up a little bit, modify it in such a way that, one, New York Times will mention me, or two, some wealthy donor will give me money. And so I guess my position would be to say, I'm not going to do that. And that this is the only way. The only way to achieve real change in the United States and globally is when we draw a line in the sand. that it may seem pointless. You might see me as, a failure. I was not able to work in the United States from 2007. I've been unemployed for long periods of time. Was not all pleasant, but I think that was much more politically meaningful than if I had compromised on 9/11 and other issues and tried to play the game here in Washington, D.C.
Just real quick on 9/11, not to go in depth, I'm just get your big picture take. I mean, I had one of my subscribers recently to the email list told me they're signing off because I believe 9/11 was a false flag operation. Right. And I'm like, I mean,
so obvious.
For me, it's not, you're not a serious person. And my response was like, I mean, in grad school in Geneva, Switzerland, I was taught this type of thing. And this is a basic historical fact. The Roman Empire has done it. Nazi Germany has done it.
Right, it's an ancient tradition.
Yeah, Russia has done it. It's a basic military. NATO has done it. Japan has done it. Israel has done it. Turkey has done it. Tell me a country which has not run the false flag operation. But just real quick, you mentioned previously, but also in one of your writings, you've written that false flags serve as a critical tool in American politics by creating mass trauma in the population that inhibits the formation of organized resistance or the possibility of rational intellectual discourse. And so just your quick take on 9/11.
Well, I think in that respect, 9/11 was extremely successful, basically shut down the American mind. And we got, to use Bloch's term, sleepwalkers, right? The people who are intellectually extremely well educated. They read books, they're lawyers, doctors, businessmen, but they're incapable of conceiving. They're basically sleepwalking through history, unable to conceive of these higher level, trauma, shifts in governance. And so 9/11, I mean, it's in some ways it's classic in that respect. I mean, if you've taken one semester of physics in high school, you can figure out that this is impossible. cannot possibly be true. And I watched it. I was in the U.S., University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign at the time. I saw it. I was not a physics major. I said, this is not possible. Something else is going on here. But there's no way that, if it's what happened, if two airliners crash into a crash, that it will cause 3 buildings made of reinforced steel, concrete, to collapse. Cannot possibly be true. So, but I think looking back on it now, that was the whole point, right? Was to, just like COVID-19, was to force feed the population and a story which was not credible from the beginning. And the purpose of that was to degrade the ability of citizens to think for themselves scientifically, and to co-opt an entire class of, intellectuals. I've written about this in based on an earlier French article, a book from the 1920s, but the treason of the intellectuals. And that was a large part of 9/11, right? And of COVID-19, this large class of privileged intellectuals, people like myself, who thought that who decided, and I saw this at the University of Illinois and elsewhere, that they would go on with this incredibly stupid, unbelievable argument on physics and on geopolitics to explain this trauma. And they went along with it. They took the money. And I think the fact that the United States, and there are always going to be some intellectuals like that, but the fact that there were so many on both 9/11 and COVID-19 who were willing to buy. I have a classmate, who's teaching at MIT, and I talked to her, and she, talking about COVID-19, she just, followed the rules. And I know that she's smart enough to know that it just doesn't make any sense scientifically. So science, as I put it in one of my articles, technology buried science in a shallow grave. So we're into a technological system in which technology is mistaken for science. We move towards this scientism as opposed to science, where science is, the truth is determined by experts at Harvard or Stanford or whatever, as opposed to by a rigorous investigation of the phenomenon. And that started before 9/11. In some ways, you can trace it back. In some ways, it started with Oklahoma, which was the precursor to 9/11. And I think if you hadn't had the trauma of Oklahoma bombings, that 9/11 would have been harder to pull off. And finally, I would conclude by saying that many of these things they're planned out. So the DARPA, the Defense Acquisition, I can't remember, the main research institute for the Pentagon, and RAND, and now there's a proliferation of these think tanks or consulting firms. From the 1960s, they carried out a whole series of studies in psychology, mass trauma, etc., in which they essentially came up with these classified plans, some of which have been declassified, most of which have not, which are basically how to transition a population from one state to another over time through the use of mass trauma. And that's what, 9/11, so Oklahoma was the first sort of point, mass trauma, 9/11, COVID-19, and there were a few in between. All of them, on the one hand, they had very specific agendas, what they're trying to do, but there was a larger agenda, which is to create a totalitarian state, which people are not aware, as you mentioned, is totalitarian, right? That there's a radical alienation, to sort of transpose, between the reality on the ground and the manner in which people from the ruling class, intellectuals who set the tone and the message, perceive the world. So we live in this fantasy world in which this is how the United States works, and then there's a reality of how it really works, and we've basically they've become two unrelated realms.
Yeah, just to comment on the academic aspect. I worked in education and academia here in Mexico, and just as you described it, I find it sad. People just will all they care about their money, their salary, their wage,
Right.
and their career. And I want the truth. And I had my classes taken away from me because I taught at the high school and university. And my trick was it's harder to get fired from the high school than it is the university. And for 1 or 2 semesters, they took away my courses at the university in international relations because I was talking like you are. Eventually, there was a new person who came in charge, and they didn't know, my way of thinking, and so I got my courses back. But yeah, it's just really sad. It just goes back to people want the money; they don't care about the truth, and they want their cushy
I've
job.
seen that. I mean, certainly many academics now, and I see this with my colleagues. I mean, people who I used to be quite close to in another lifetime. And so the priority is on getting grants. And so grants are following along, certainly not scientific method, right? Along with what grantors want and the process. And this, I think, goes back to what I was saying about the end of the Cold War, is we no longer have a sense of the public good or, of government or institutions that are run for the public good. And so increasingly, whether you're, at Harvard or, at Harvard, we have the Drew Faust, the previous president. When she retired, she was appointed to the board of directors of Goldman Sachs. Unprecedented in American history, but it's telling. So the priority for these research institutes and their administrators is their ability to suck up to global capital. That is what it's about. And so obviously, if we're talking about Goldman Sachs or BlackRock or other, Blackstone, other funds, these guys are sophisticated. They hire their consulting firms that tell them how to modify teaching and academic research at Harvard over time so that it serves your purpose, essentially to cover your tracks for you, but doesn't do it in too explicit a way. You throw in a little bit of multiculturalism, a little bit of gender theory, talk about how unfair it is, that poor people are not doing so well, but don't identify the process, right? How you got there. And so it's become, I think it's a major industry, this whole sort of distortion of reality, the advertising, public relations, consulting, and then on beyond, into research, academics, journalism, and the basic principles now. It's a form of prostitution. Prostitution. I mean, I like to talk about recently this issues of incest, rape, and prostitution, which are the three sort of these fundamental traumas in human relations, sexual relations, but sexual relations are very profound in our society. And all of them, incest, rape, and prostitution, have their equivalents in our political world and in our intellectual world. And that's what we're really seeing, is increasingly we're talking about prostitution, but all of those. Incest is the false flag, the internal compromise in which the compromise is so profound, so it's so compromising to the victim that it can't even be addressed. Rape is similar in that it brings the person into this relationship, which was unwanted, but in a way which is so embarrassing and sometimes involves, of course, some sort of mutual attraction within the process, which makes it so horrific that the individual cannot even conceive of what happened. And so many cases of rape in the real world, people never report it because it's so demeaning to the self, and they can't even confront it in themselves. And in the case of prostitution, obviously, it becomes a service, that which could be expression of concern or affection or love or commitment to family, becomes a means of making money. And that we also see all across, especially in education, where rather than being some sort of concern or with society or with one's students, one's family, right, that it becomes just a means to produce money by maybe not selling your body, but selling your soul.
Yeah, and I wanted to have you unpack COVID 1984, as I call it, and basically this the same thesis I've held from the very beginning, January 2020. You kind of put into words. I never viewed that there was a pandemic at all, and my theory has been that it was either some sort of biological weapon, that it was planned, this whole event, but it was some sort of low key bioweapon, or that it was all entirely manufactured from whole cloth. Either way, there was no pandemic. We just could have gone on with our lives normally. But
Right.
You wrote recently on your Substack, and I really recommend people read this article. The links will be in the description. You say Operation COVID-19 was a global coup d'etat disguised as a pandemic that was launched against China and the world in December 2019, and that continues on to the present. You say that the reality is that a tiny group of key players representing the super rich in the US and in China coordinate closely to promote COVID lockdowns in China. And you basically say, and this was my view, because all nations did it. I was living in Kazakhstan. I fled
Right.
through the US to Mexico, and everywhere they were applying this digital dictatorship, this algorithm
Right.
ghetto, social credit system, electronic
Right.
concentration camp, passports, QR codes, injections. And I mean, in some places you couldn't even buy food. It's like the Book of Revelation. You can't buy or sell without the mark. You can't buy food. In
That's true.
some places they say you can't even go to the public park without vaccine certificates.
Right.
So and I can see that it's elites. It's a global elite that has no allegiance to nationality. So it's in the
Right.
US, it's in the US elite, it's a Chinese elite, and they use, as you said, these private tech IT
Right.
companies that are
Right.
already embedded within all of our countries. So we're basically
Right.
being run by big tech. So
Right.
could you tell us more about how you
Right.
see COVID?
Right. Well, I think you described it quite accurately there. I maybe just add a few words to say how it works. I think one of the key aspects is this concept of government. So what you have now is we're being fed this narrative by a controlled opposition to say government is bad, inherently bad, and all the bad things happen because of evil politicians or bad government. Now, obviously government is bad, but I think if you say that government cannot possibly serve the purpose, the needs of the people, that this is a nihilistic and depressing perspective. And I think it's being force-fed to us by those power elites in order to discourage us from trying to organize ourselves and create government. So that was the first thing I would say. The second part is talking about IT, that basically the primary transformation is the takeover of local government and central governments around the world by these IT companies. So you have a local, whether it's in Sichuan province, or it's in Oklahoma, or for that matter in any other country in the world, local governments will be lobbied and then intimidated, both bribed and threatened, in order to get these IT companies to essentially run government for them. And so, whereas you previously had government officials, good and bad, but they basically made the decisions based upon various pressures from around them. Now you have like one or two government officials, the president or the governor or whatever, and their job is just to outsource the budget to these IT companies who run everything for them. And this, of course, happened in universities, happened in other places as well. So this is a profound transformation. So essentially, when you see something which says government does this, or this is government, QR code, government is scanning it, there's no government. It's not government in any sense of the word. It's a totalitarian dictatorship of these global IT companies. And they have some funny ways to hide their tracks, but it's not that hard to figure out. I mean, basically Amazon, Google, Alibaba. I mean, there's like 10 or so big players, and then there are smaller customized players. For example, as I mentioned about Israel, like Black Cube, or these customized private intelligence firms that work on and I think they were very much involved in what's happened in China. And I was criticized for this, for not giving the evidence, but just take my word for it. I'd be happy to give you the evidence at some future date, but they also, I think, are very much involved in it. And so that we combine these sort of precedents. On the one hand, we have the research from DARPA and from RAND from the 1960s and 70s, how to modify people's behavior and also how to take over basically the government through this privatization drive. Then we have the research from Guantanamo Bay and the so-called torture programs, and from after 2001, in which experiments were carried out. Naomi Klein describes this in some detail on how to modify behavior through isolation, i.e., social distancing, masks, and other forms of repeated ritual behavior. And these rituals are set up to be meaningless and fraudulent, and most importantly, that the person involved at some level knows that they're fraudulent, but still does them. And that degrades the ability to resist. So you create very passive environments through that. And that those two sort of themes were combined with some understanding of IT and how it could be used to induce a passive, narcissistic, self-indulgent, and decadent culture among people, especially sort of the mid-level ruling class. And that's I discussed this in my article, The Terrarium Economy, in which we get sort of this sort of fake ruling class. People who went to Harvard, they become lawyers and doctors, they own, $3 million, $5 million, $10 million in assets in a house, by the beach or in France or in Italy, and they think they're ruling class. But it's a fraud, right? The ruling class are these people who control basically the means of production, and they control the nature of money. And those people are worth, hundreds of billions. We don't even know how much they're worth because they make it up. And for those people, the difference between, a lawyer who has $10 million in assets and a homeless person is like the difference between, a roly-poly and a spider. I mean, we're all bugs from their perspective, but they know, based upon the reports they got from their private, intelligence and strategy teams, that by creating this false terrarium economy wherein there's an imagined ruling class headed by someone like Biden or and there's poor people in it, and there's this sort of conflict within there, that you can sort of blind people to the fact that it's all enclosed and controlled by this elite group. And finally, I just add one word on that much of the analysis, and I hate to stress sort of Marxist analysis because I'm not really a Marxist, but I'm practical. Whatever works, I will use, as I was talking about Josh the other day. And so Marxist economics is extremely helpful. I don't think we should dismiss it just because we have some sort of bias fed to us by controlled opposition. And so basically, we're in this trap system, and ideology is being controlled by these people, means of production, means of distribution, means of communication, and money itself is being controlled with them. And they're dumbing us down. I think we have supercomputers doing this. They're calculated out, how fast or how slow to move towards a totalitarian system, how to create false conflicts, like Trump is excluded from Twitter or whatever, totally irrelevant. But it works because people's thinking has been degraded by technology, and technology increasingly, including Facebook or Twitter, it's being designed to degrade your ability to think.
Yeah, and just to go to a step further, where they want to take us, because I feel like we're still in the eye of the storm. Operation
Sure.
Operation COVID is not yet finished by any means, and you write, as a result, global institutions like Bretton Woods, UN, IT corporations, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Oracle are being militarized as we speak. What they have been authorized to do to Russians today, they will do to you tomorrow, and there will be no appeal precisely because the policies were formulated and implemented in secret. Your bank account, your automobile, your every action can be shut down by these hidden forces. The oppression of citizens in Canada, New Zealand, and Austria was the front line of this war against the citizens of the earth. Now something far worse is slouching towards Kiev to be born. A shadow government lurks behind the titles U.S. government, German government, NATO, World Bank, or UN, and it will be able to seize everything you possess and put you in jail without any due process. A lot of people talk about World Economic Forum, the Great Reset, techno-fascism, global technocracy. And I like the term algorithm ghetto because it's putting us, and I think they want to sort of create this global government or global totalitarian system where all nations are run like this. And if you don't think like the system wants you to think, it'll just shut you off. You can't go to work. Your permission to travel will be shut off locally or internationally. You don't even have your. I mean, here and where I used to work, all the teachers had to get injected or they lost their job. I know people who were fired because they refused to be injected with what I call Pentagon juice, because it was the Pentagon, DARPA in 2012 who created that mRNA tech. So just your further thoughts on their end game, what they're trying to achieve, and in all countries, like we see countries like Russia. I mean, you touch on this again. That is the struggles in nations. Like you see in Russia, they're implementing some of this stuff. China, every nation to different degrees. So, what's sort of their end game?
Right. Well, I think that their end game first is to defang the population. I think that's number one priority, is that they may not have a complete consensus among the global elite on what the end game is. Some people, this is my speculation, some people wouldn't just kill 95% of the population. Others are more open to having a large slave population, and so it's not clear whether the population should be 3 billion or 500 million or whatever. And this is related, of course, to the confusion about what climate change is and how catastrophic it is. So if you embrace among the globalists the idea that climate change really is catastrophic and we're not going to be able to live on this planet for a variety of reasons, then obviously you have to bring the population down to about 400 million because it can't support that number of people. If you don't believe that, or you think it's more or less stable, then obviously you can tolerate more. So it's not clear. I think there's not a total decision consensus to say we all globalists agree that we're going to kill off this many and we're going to keep as slaves this many. So there is some debate, but the basic assumptions are the same, that we will create a sort of false sense of democratic process and liberalism, sort of false multicultural, gender, good feeling rainbow flag stuff, as a way to sort of fool people, and for the period until we get them to the next stage. And when we get to the next stage, if you're in your house and at any moment the so-called government can shut off your credit cards, and if you go outside, a drone will shoot you dead, then we don't have to care what you think, right? We've gotten to the next stage, and then at that point, I think all the the feel-good multi-culti stuff can go in the garbage, because now we have essentially implemented the next stage, and at that point, then I think we're looking at the real Third World War, which will be quite brutal. And I also want to note, as I said in my paper. In my article on Opium War, that I really do think that Israel played a major role in this process. I'm not saying that. I mean, it's not. I mean, my father is Jewish, so I mean, I can't take say blame everything on Jews. I mean, any more than Marx could do so. But I think that if we look at the know-how for QR codes and geofencing and all these things, that basically Israel was the pioneer in this, and that many of the programs that are being used now globally in the United States and places like Oklahoma and Louisiana were based on Israeli models for social control. And the Israelis have an expertise that they built up. I mean, on the one hand, there's the DARPA studies, RAND studies in the background, but the Israelis were quite expert in how to control people and monitor them 24/7. And the sort of cutting edge was in Israel, and now they found a global market for it in this COVID-19 operation, and it's been enormous, profits for these specialized private Israeli firms all over, including places probably everywhere. I mean, it's been documented in the case of the United States, for example, in Louisiana and Oklahoma, but my guess is in places like China or even in Russia that there's substantial amount of outsourcing of these, control systems, IT systems. Probably we have some sort of, symbiotic relationship between big tech, Amazon, Cisco, Google, Facebook, the big players, and then the specialized, say, like Black Cube or these others, these Israeli IT intelligence firms, which do the initial work and some of the dirty work.
And just to get a little geopolitical, get your thoughts on, I mean, you mentioned World War III, there's Ukraine and China now. I mean, basically the big three powers, right? The US, NATO, Brussels, EU West, and then that pole of Russia and China, the Taiwan issue, and Ukraine. And as you said, all governments seem to have been penetrated by these IT, private intelligence,
for sure,
transnational elite networks. But at the same time, we see rivalry between, US, China, Russia. How do you sort of explain this, apparent contradiction, and how things might, what's sort of Putin's vision as you see it, or Xi Jinping's vision, and where things might go?
Right. Well, I think this is one of the major problems we have in politics and in journalism is just that our intellectual capacity has been so degraded. People don't read books. They don't understand philosophy. I mean, if you go back, 1960s or 1940s, a lot of people engaged in journalism or in discussion in universities. They knew, they read Kant, they knew about, Aristotle, or for that matter, Confucius, and they had an understanding of these epistemological and teleological problematics behind politics. And that has all been sort of cleared out. So we're stuck with a politics of like bad guys and, country to country confrontations. And because our minds have been so simplified, the schemata we use are so crude, it's hard for us to think three-dimensionally about how you can have conflicts between nation states at the same time that you have cooperation between multinational corporations, et cetera. And so I would say there are basically four sort of axes. One is the nation state. It hasn't disappeared, probably won't. It has an enduring quality. No matter how outdated it is, it appeals to part of the human brain to say, I have a country and I belong to it. The second is the multinational the corporations, which they follow their own rules. They fight with each other, and sometimes they hate each other, but they're not following the trajectory of the structure of the nation state. And we see this increasingly to be the case because of the IT revolution, if you will. The third is the ethnic group, the sense of being, whether it's Caucasian or Chinese or, Indian. And we have these transnational ethnic groups which span the world. And increasingly we have populations of Indians in the United States or, in South Africa or wherever, who work together in their own way. It doesn't necessarily correspond with that of the multinational corporation, but it's significant. And the final is class. And class, as we know, has been intentionally, I think, stamped as being a Marxist communist concept that is sort of like forbidden. In fact, the idea of class as an essential issue in politics and society, Mills talked about it. It was not a Marxist concept. And I think it's really important for us to sort of take that out, to say we can talk about class and class interest without embracing, a Marxist perspective. And it should be front and center of our analysis. So it's very hard to understand what's going on without getting those four different players. And what we're seeing is essentially an interference pattern between these different factors. So to answer your question, I'm sorry it took so long. I think someone like Putin or Xi Jinping are not so free in their decision-making process. In some ways, I think the compromise they make is they get to be on TV and make it look like they make decisions, but in fact, that they basically have to play to the needs of these multinational corporations and billionaires, wealthy individuals in their country and around the world who are pulling their strings, and that's increasingly the case. So I wouldn't say the nation state has disappeared, and there are bureaucratic entities which are, focused on the particular nation, like Russia or the United States. But I would say increasingly transnational forces are quite significant, and it's not totally new. The First World War followed the same trajectory, basically, and we had the contradictions of these joint held in 1914 petrochemical, steel, weapons manufacturers, in which British, French, Russian, German owned stakes in weapons manufacturing in each of these countries, making profits off of wars, and that was essentially how the First World War unfolded. Of course, it changed in nature once you had millions of people dead, and you could no longer pull that off. But the initial start of the First World War is basically another. I don't know if false flag is the right word for it, but basically the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was not a totally clean thing, and it certainly didn't need to end up in a world war. It became a world war because of the financial interests in it, and was these various different extremely wealthy families who had bought into arms manufacturing, and that's what led to basically the Russian and the German Revolution in 1918, 1919.
You're just on the issue of Marx. I've been classified as a commie, which is nothing of the sort, and I feel just like you. It's very useful Marxian analysis. I've had many leftists and Marxists on to have them break things down, and the use of class as well. Obviously, I've met people in the U.S., Americans, who were upper class, rich, who would refuse to talk to me because I was local. Like literally, we'd be sitting at the table, and they don't talk to me. But then someone else comes along who's in their class. They can't shut up. The two of them go talking, but they won't talk to me because I'm a lower class. So obviously this is a reality. And there was one point I think where I agree with most of what you're saying. There was one point I didn't agree on, but I'm not here to debate.
I'm curious.
But it's in your book where you talk about the climate security threat, and I think you were talking about ending the use of petroleum and coal. I think the war economy.
You think I went too far?
No more cars and fewer airplanes. I think the issue is I see what we were talking about earlier. We see some of these people, like the Klaus Schwabs and all these people saying that as well. So it's kind of like to separate. Well, what's your take on the climate security issue?
So I really appreciate you bringing that up, and it has been an issue previously because things that I wrote that a while ago, right? The issue about the response to climate and to the petroleum-based economy, and sadly, that agenda has been taken up with people with a totally different, intention than myself. So my intention was at multiple levels: energy independence, i.e., produce your own energy and reduce your use of energy. Second was that to eliminate the role of petrochemical corporations and those banks related to it, their political influence. So we make policy, whether it's how we run our communities, without being force-fed automobiles and freeways and other things, which we didn't used to have and we don't need, and they're very destructive. So it's a multifaceted. It's not simply to say that climate change is going to kill us all, but also say that automobiles are dangerous, that petrochemicals are bad for you and for the environment. And it's basically a hidden tax for multinational corporations. Every time you have to use plastics, you have to use automobiles, whatever, to live because of the way corrupt politicians have designed your city, then you're being forced to support this totalitarian system. But to come to the issue of climate change, is what I discussed with Josh the other day. I start out by saying, I don't know. I mean, my knowledge is limited, but I have read now quite a lot on the subject, and I taught a class on climate change, and I think there is sufficient evidence to say that is a general phenomenon that we're seeing a major alteration of the climate. However, to say that it's simplistically because we have too many, petroleum-driven cars is not the case. The climate change is a result. It's a complex phenomenon. It involves the misuse of land, misuse of water, spread of deserts that result, the destruction of the oceans from microplastics, a whole variety, and then the collapse of biodiversity, which many scientists say is a much more serious threat than the alteration of the climate for us. So there are multiple factors involved. And unfortunately, the discourse in academics and in the media has been simplified and reduced to a cartoonish way. So on the one hand, you have, Greta Thunberg, is that the name, and Al Gore and other people who give this incredibly simplistic, vision of what needs to be done, and it doesn't touch, class. It doesn't address who owns, Exxon and how do they use it, how is it related to foreign war. I mean, none of that is there. It's just to say, and of course, the assumption is that politicians are insensitive and don't listen to the people, and they don't know what's really happening, which is definitely not the case. Politicians know exactly what's happening, but they have their masters. And so that sort of analysis that we see in many, I'd say most of the sort of environmental climate change NGOs is a blatant fraud. But the concern of a catastrophic alteration of our climate, of our biosystem that might lead eventually to human extinction, I would not dismiss that. I would only say that it looks like these exaggerated scenarios in which people say, well, I'll be dead in 10 years or 20 years, 30 years, that this seems pretty clear to have been wrong. But it doesn't mean we won't all be dead in 1,000 years, right? Or in 500 years. And I think that's not acceptable. On the other hand, we have these, Trump and others who say that all discussion of climate change or alteration is all a fraud. It's fine to use, fossil fuels, and we're being misled by this fake, IMF, World Economic Forum agenda to believe things which are totally false. And I don't buy that at all. I think that argument is funded also by corporate interests, and most notably that when they criticize those drawing attention to the threat to the environment, to the climate, they attack these cardboard figures like Greta or Al Gore. They don't go after books like The Sixth Extinction or these rather complex, carefully written, books which describe a complex, dangerous phenomenon in the world. And so basically, the reason why people are skeptical of climate change, in my opinion, is that climate change is like scientism, or for that matter, COVID-19. Climate change is being defined for us by a tiny group of self-interested people who are being backed by global finance. And their purpose is not to end climate change, but to use climate change, again, as a trauma, a deep psychological mass trauma that will allow us to move people to somewhere they would never go naturally. And that is to a system in which money is controlled by multinational banks through their fronts, their NGO fronts, or their so-called, global governance.
We've covered, I think, the main points, and then one of my last questions for you would be our response to all of these things, these crazy global elites. And my response is twofold: is trying to resist, as you talk about, politically fight back, speak the truth, organizing, but also the second part is preparing for worser case scenarios. Like if my accounts are getting shut off and I can't use money anymore and I'm going to starve to death, well, I have to start preparing. There's a lot of people fleeing down here to Mexico where I am. There's people leaving urban areas to rural areas. They're creating their plan Bs, plot of land with water and food, creating networks, decentralizing, using technology as well. And so just what do we do? What's sort of your advice? How do we move forward now?
Right. Well, the first point I would stress is that the current system in the United States and globally is so corrupt, so infected that it cannot be reformed internally. That would be I think we all have to recognize this. So you're not going to elect somebody, whether it's in Mexico or the United States, who's going to be, your Mexican president was one of the better politicians out there in the world. But what he could do was quite limited by the system in which he's working. And by the way, I should mention that my book, I only had 2 commercial publishers that were willing to publish my book, Fear No Evil, and that was in Mexico and South Korea. So I'm very grateful, actually, to the Mexican people for supporting me back then, 2.5 years ago. So that's the first thing. Second, so that means we have to create our own system. And what I advocate, I've written about this now at length, is to say that a lot of us are in serious trouble, but we need to come together and to support ourselves and to create our own communities, which are institutionalized, right? So you, me, a couple other people say, we form our own government. We have our own constitution. We're committed to each other, and we create our own economy, where we produce our own food, we create our own utensils and instruments, and we are essentially independent. Now, of course, the powers that be want to shut this down, and they'll use extreme methods. But if we get to a critical mass in our country, in our region, in our country and globally, they will not be able to do that. That doesn't mean they won't be able to kill some of us, but I think they will not be able to shut down such a movement. But I think what's most difficult about it is that it means essentially giving up hope in all these false promises that have been made to us, that we thought the UN, me too included, the United Nations, the United States, or European Union, other organizations, that they could, play some sort of positive role. And that we really have to build from the bottom up, from basically you, me, our neighbors come together and say, we'll help each other. We'll grow food or build things, make our, clothes, whatever it is. And that although it seems incredibly, backwards and inefficient and counterproductive to go down to that level, the basic means of production, that in fact, in the long term, that forms the solid foundation for something which is independent. And that by contrast, we have so many thoughtful people, progressives or whoever, they're trapped in the system. To some degree, that's true of me. They're dependent on money given to them by progressive thinking rich people, and they're unable to address real issues. So if you had to choose, you're better off being independent. And I'm not just independent candidate, but when I was in Korea, essentially unable to work in the US, the last year, I lived in Yeosu in the south of Korea. We had a tiny apartment. I lived minimally and with my friend who's on the second floor, and we cooked together, we cooperated. Our costs were very low, and we were able to sustain ourselves and be politically active. It doesn't require money. In fact, most political action does not require money, but we're fed this line that somehow, unless you have, millions of dollars flowing in like Bernie Sanders or whatever, that you can't be politically active. It's a fiction. It's a fiction. In fact, I think the real revolution will come when people snap out of this narcissistic view of success for me, recognize cooperation and mutual support as the foundation of political action, and start to create their own truly independent communities, which will be the building blocks on which we create. I don't want to say it's a totally new system, because it will be based on moral philosophy, ideas about governance that go back, thousands of years. So I'm not, in that respect, I'm not a Marxist, right? I don't saying throw away everything and we're going to engage in some radical modernism. I think, if anything, we need to go back to governance as it existed before. In the United States, as I've written, the native peoples, like the Iroquois, had tremendously sophisticated ideas that were based on long-term sustainable development. And for that matter, in China as well. It's hard to imagine now, but there were ideas about economics in which you looked at where you're going to be in 200 years, not, next month's stock returns on your stock, and that sort of revolutionary change in the at the conceptual level, I think, will be the part that goes together with the independent community. Independent community changes the economic means of production and support, and the intellectual philosophical revolution says growth, consumption are bad. Right? I mean, frugality is a virtue, right? And the intellectual depth, spiritual depth, is far superior to consumption, going to movies, traveling, whatever. You can sit in your own room, little space, and have profoundly deep, philosophical, spiritual experience from reading books, talking to people, creating art. It doesn't take money. And in fact, that would be my final point, is that I think we have to end the money economy, that we humans have lived on the earth for millions of years with minimal use of money. And that even until the 1930s, most people supported themselves at the local level through mutual support, right? You get butter from your neighbor, carrots from another neighbor, you give your potatoes, that sort of exchange. Some of it included money, but most of it did not include money. You produce energy from a windmill or from a water mill, or from your horse or your cow or your own manual labor, and you're basically economically independent. You need some money on the weekends, or to go to the market and buy some specialized products. But I think basically it's entirely possible and preferable to pull ourselves out of this digitalized monetary system, which is the primary tool used by the global elite to pin us down and to sort of slowly ease us into slavery.
Yeah, they want to put us on their digital farm and get us off of our farm. And you echo a lot of sentiments from past guests I've had that talk about basically what you're saying in different ways, with variations, like a parallel society, parallel structure, parallel economy, and that sort of thing. And so where would be the best place for people to go to find out? I'll include all of the links in the descriptions, but if you want to tell us, where's the best place for people to go to find your work?
Well, so, obviously the best starting point is to be able to sit down with your own family and have a serious discussion about what's happening in the United States. It trumps everything else, because so many families, people are not able to speak honestly about what's happening, or even to address the challenges that we face. So we have to overcome this taboo, the sort of forbidden truths, and have real discussions with family members, friends, and neighbors. For my part, my little contribution, I hope, is to be a catalyst to get people to say, yeah, that's the way to go. And obviously, I'm here to support you. If you want to contact me, I'll do everything I can to be helpful to you. In terms of websites, I have my own blog, Circles and Squares. Asia. I do a lot of writing in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, and I have stuff in Spanish and other languages as well, which might be interesting to those. My field is Asia. So I was a Chinese major. I studied Japanese for many years and Korean as well. And then I have for my presidential candidacy, I have EmanuelPrez.com, and that has my speeches, my book in 14 languages, and then the prefaces in another 20 languages, and then my speeches and writings. And then I have the Provisional Government Asia, US Prov Gov, in which I sort of put down some of the basic concepts for what a provisional government based on the Constitution of the United States would be. And a purpose of that is to say, obviously, I can't do it myself, but I can set at least a vision for what is possible that would inspire other people to do it. And the underlying assumption there is that at least the strategy behind that is to say, these people control everything now. How do you overthrow that? And I think there's some basic principles in politics about how you do it. And the first is to say that they have no legitimacy, that the United States is based upon the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That defines the United States. Other organizations which defy that basic understanding and agreement, which defines government, those are not government. They're criminal syndicates. And so we need to identify among a larger, and it's already started, but a larger population of ordinary working people and intellectuals, this sense that this is our position. We are the government. Why are we the government? Because we follow the Constitution. We follow the rule of law, and we follow the scientific method. Those people say they're government, but if we look at them, they're set up by Google and Facebook and Israeli private intelligence firms, etc. They're not government in any sense. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party, there's not a word in the Constitution about the role of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. So if they are making policy, then this is profoundly unconstitutional. They have seized control of the process of making law and enforcing law. I mean, both privatization of police and the military, and also the process of making policy within these political parties. So our position, I think the smarter position is to pull back and say, I'm not going to engage. I'm going to talk. I mean, I'd love to be on the show, but I'm not interested in compromising with these people. I'm going to say, me, you, a couple of my friends, we are the United States. These people are running a criminal syndicate that is posing as the United States, but they have no legitimacy. Now, this declaration in itself does not change. It's not magic, right? It's sort of you might say a speech act. Is that the theory of the 1930s on literature? It's like a getting married, right? The priest says, "I declare you man and wife," right? Now this is just doesn't mean anything, right? But because of its ritual power and the way that it's set up, it is transformative. It suddenly makes people committed to a lifetime together, and so something like that to say, we declare that we are independent, that we follow the Constitution, that we are the government, that we are going to form a more perfect union amongst ourselves. At the beginning, maybe people won't take it seriously, but over time, they will, and that we will build up from the ground up. But the underlying implication there is that most of these institutions, including universities and government and all sorts of other organizations, they used to serve their function. They could serve their function again, but now they are essentially criminal syndicates. They do not have legitimacy in my eyes. And anybody who looks at it objectively and gets beyond this trauma, I think it's quite clear what we're looking at.
As Tommy J said, Thomas Jefferson in the poster behind me, liberty
Yes.
begins with you. So
Very
there's
true.
a lot to digest there, Emanuel, and I'd like to thank you again for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Much appreciated. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. I had a lot of trouble I'm just back in the U.S., so I'm readjusting, and to be honest, for a while there, I thought I'd never get back to the U.S. So I think there is hope, and there are people who are really trying, and that starting with you, we can really change things.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up to the free email list that notifies you of every new podcast and other important updates. The email list and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's almost impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently strikes videos. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit, Twitter, and LinkedIn take down posts. After the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, or the Atlantic Council, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account at one point. In April of 2022, the Department of Homeland Security had PayPal ban us for life. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the entire podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. You can support this guerrilla signal by donating via DonorBox, Buy Me a Coffee, Subscribestar, or Crypto. You can purchase a consultation with the host to talk about expatriation, geopolitics, or podcasting. You can also become a monthly or annual member via Stripe and receive benefits such as partaking in a monthly member Zoom call, get access to a weekly recording of my random thoughts, and a private Telegram channel. Thank you for listening.